August 5th, 2024.
Game Informer is closing down.
Game Informer's parent company GameStop abruptly closed the publication, shuttering its website and laying off its entire staff. After 33 years of games media excellence, one of the pillars of the industry has fallen. And you may be asking, hey Andrew, who cares? Why does that matter? And to that I'll say, first off, we are not on a first name basis. That's Mr. Hardwired to you. And secondly, I care. Because since the 70s, we've seen a massive jump not only in the popularity of games themselves, but in the media surrounding them. As with any industry this big, there are bound to be issues specific to it. Issues that need to be investigated, addressed, and most importantly, publicized. Games journalists have been both the vanguard and the guardians of the industry. Now I want to make a very clear distinction here between games writing and what can really be classified as video game journalism. Video game journalists spend less time talking just about games and analyzing games, instead choosing to focus on the people and organizations and culture behind them. Because despite the vivid stories, realistic graphics, and goofy concepts, the industry of making games is full of complicated and sometimes extremely dark stories, which is why we need reporters out there as watchdogs covering everything from endless cycles of crunch to the messy business of mergers and layoffs. Reporters like Jason Schreier and Wesley LeBlanc are the lifeblood of this medium, a lifeblood that may soon dry out if we're not careful. So while many kids are heading back to school, I want to teach you some history that you won't find in a classroom. I'm Andrew Hamilton from Hardwired, and this is a very brief history of video game journalism. The early days of games media begins in the neon-clad pixelated era of the 80s, where consumer-facing magazines began to pop up amid the rise in home entertainment and arcades. This early era can be split into two writing types: journalistic industry news found in Business for Big Tech Boys, not a real magazine, and the more enthusiast-oriented colorful magazines. In November of 1981, a British publisher called EMAP launched Computer and Video Game Magazine, which, judging by its super fun and creative name, I'm sure was a blast to read. Following suit just 2 weeks later, and a lot better, in 1981, journalists Bill Kunkel and Arnie Katz launched Electronic Games. This would be our first magazine completely dedicated to that gamer life. While traditional press scoffed at the nerds and their games for babies, the games media industry was seeing a drastic rise in circulation and competition. These magazines were for sure more entertainment focused, featuring information of upcoming or recently released video games, and what appeared to be screenshots of the games, which was a big deal at the time. But fun fact, the screenshots on these pages, those aren't pictures. They're drawings. The more games released to the public, the more the public interest grew, resulting in a meteoric rise in new publications using gamers who aspired to be journalists to write for them. This was a relatively new approach at the time, but it let the people participating in the culture speak right to the one-up of the readers. Unfortunately, all the enthusiasm in the world couldn't save the game industry from the bleak reality of an oversaturated market, which eventually led to the video game crash of 1983. Many magazines shut their doors between 1984 and 85, but even this crash would be short-lived, thanks to the power of the NES, the Nintendo Entertainment System. Nintendo's explosive home console had almost single-handedly revived interest in gaming, allowing publications to ride that blast into the early 90s. Only 90s kids will remember the weirdness that was video games in the media during that time, because now this once niche hobby was kind of everywhere. Commercials, theaters, and even politics. This is where publications began to cross more into the modern game journalism we know today. Politicians spent weeks on Capitol Hill decrying the evils of video game, leading to the establishment of the ESRB rating system. Unfortunately for those elected representatives, this would backfire, creating a surge of interest in every sector of gaming. This frenzy led to more publications embracing a gaming beat, and most notably for our purposes, led FuncoLand to launch their Game Informer newsletter that would change the games journalism space forever. Game Informer wasn't like the rest of the publications. Well, I mean it was, because it was also covering video games, but it was smaller, more focused, tight-knit, and oftentimes some of the most knowledgeable people in the entire industry were working there. But what really helped Game Informer skyrocket into mass circulation was the heavily marketed nature of their publication in the first place. It appeared in all FuncoLand stores, was promoted by FuncoLand employees, and even later, when they were acquired to GameStop, became part of GameStop's Power to the Players program. In the late 90s, game journalism made a leap to the digital space of the internet, spawning places like IGN in 1997 to offer a more wide-ranging, one-stop shop kind of media coverage available in most any form. And initially, Game Informer struggled with this change, but the 2000s saw Game Informer take on more clout, and they firmly established their position at the top in 2002 2022 when they began to use each issue to deep dive into a newly revealed game. Like a nitrous boost to the magazine, this one move would create the arms race to get exclusive reveals that still exist today. Game Informer's subscription service meant that it was free from the shackles of ad revenue and big publishers to do what it pleased with the contents of the magazine. Their biggest hurdle, though, would come in adapting to the power of the internet, but eventually they would need to fully embrace the chronic onlineness. This was their biggest hurdle and one they needed to handle quickly. As video essays, blogs, podcasts, and shows populated the web, it became clear any print publication that didn't adapt was going to die. Like I said at the beginning of the video, after 33 years of being a gold standard in video game journalism, GameStop has killed an industry titan. And for what? Well, it wasn't because they failed to adapt to the digital age, as they embraced a digital side and began to offer videos, digital editions, and some of the coolest ideas for their website, which was fantastic to use, easy and uncrowded. Their team was able to bring their direct-to-consumer model out while still covering the dark sides of the industry, whether that be things like Microsoft's acquisition of Activision Blizzard, or layoffs happening over at Bungie, deplorable working conditions at Riot, Crunch, and just in general the reality behind multi-million-dollar games. This important human element allowed the spotlight to shine on the more difficult to look at parts of gaming, but it also made sure that you understand there's a person behind every pixel. No, I suspect the reasons come from a more verifiably consistent string of poor decision making from everyone's favorite meme stock company, GameStop. But I wanted to know more about what happened and how the staff handled it. So I sat down Zoom style with Brian Shea, former digital content manager and lead at Game Informer, to discuss the abrupt closure, the legacy of the historic magazine, and why this is a sign we need game journalism now more than ever. What was the legacy of Game Informer?
Walking in the first day, all the way up until the last day, it truly felt like, walking on hallowed grounds, right? Like, this was a magazine that I grew up reading. This was like, how I found out about games like Gears of War and Batman Arkham Asylum. Was like, these magazines arrived in my college mailbox. Game Informer has always had kind of like this startup mentality. We would all wear different hats to accomplish the goal of getting out an issue every month.
When GameStop announced the closure, what was the feeling and what went through your head?
I think it was a little bit of shock. The awful headlining news was Game Informer closes, and I'm out of a job. All these people that I worked with for so long and developed amazing relationships with and almost consider family at this point. They no longer have their livelihoods. But the extra little cherry of sadness on top is that my favorite magazine no longer exists as well.
There is a feeling in particular in the world of journalism that corporations don't respect the teams that cover the various industries that they work in. Specifically in the video game industry, it's led to calls for a more sustainable games media. So I asked Shea, what does a sustainable games media even look like?
I mean, that's the question, right? We evidently are not seeing that in a lot of places right now. For a while it was like, oh, what if it's owned by a corporation? And that has proven that might lead to some sustainability, but it also might lead to surprise closures, such as we've seen at Game Informer and other outlets. I can't help but think that something like Kickstarter or Patreon, or something that allows the consumers to go straight to them and support them, is the best way, but that's not going to be the right path for everyone. I don't know if I could start a Patreon tomorrow and talk about hey, we're going to start up a new gaming magazine, and I'm going to have 5 people on staff, and we're going to put out this magazine every month. I don't know if that would ever reach sustainability, because that's a lot of money required to make that happen. So it really is a question of trying to find where it is sustainable. I mean, right now I'm just trying to find my own way with my podcast and everything in the meantime, while I figure out what's next in terms of a long-term solution. But yeah, I mean, I think that kind of getting because that's the other thing is the other idea was just get online ads, and that the bottom has dropped out on online advertising as well, where it's even if somebody doesn't use ad blockers, which I would say the majority of readers probably do at this point, it's also the pay for those online ads is pretty low compared to what I think that the initial idea behind online advertising was. So that is also, I mean, maybe it's sustainable at like higher levels, but that's also not the most sustainable route. So it's really, I think, going to involve some retooling. It might be something like what Stephen Totillo is doing. He's the former editor-in-chief of Kotaku when I was writing freelance for them. He has like a newsletter now, and it seems to be doing quite well. And he just kind of does it on his own, and it's extremely well done, and it's well supported. And then there's also like a lot of journalists who have been laid off from places and they founded their own thing. The one that immediately comes to mind is Aftermath. It's a bunch of former coworkers and they're writing their own stuff. It's employee owned, and nobody can really take that away from them. Like I have my podcast as independent, and it's great because unless like a great technology outage occurs, like nobody can take the podcast away from me. It's something that I have, and it's able to be a part of wherever I go from now until I stop doing it,
As for the upcoming generation of games journalists, Brian says that the best thing you can do is have thick skin and make something that you're proud of.
Say, like, try to make something your own, whether that is developing an audience with like a blog that you have, or a podcast or a YouTube channel, or whatever the route you want to go. That would be the best way to go. And if you do want to go a like more established route, like if you like your dream is to get a job at IGN or GameSpot or something, the best advice I could probably give you there is just write until you're relevant. That's essentially the route that I took. And maybe my advice is outdated at this point, because the last time I had to really kind of break in was a decade ago, and things nowadays shift so fast. But yeah, I think writing until you're relevant, get right for no one else, write for yourself and really hone your voice.
Video games are an ever-changing format, and so is the world of journalism, where content creators are more parasocial relationships we attach way too much of ourselves to. And independent games media brings us the truth, no matter how hard it is to face. Without reporting on the culture of places like Riot Games, the industry would be a more toxic, less jovial and vibrant place. Without constant scrutiny, corporations could get away with whatever nefarious nonsense they wanted. But journalists put that in the public eye. Is every game journalist a master of the controller? No. But they don't have to be, because they care about every person who picks one up. Game Informer is just the latest example of large businesses with no love for the industry erasing games media, costing us massive amounts of knowledge, and most importantly, eyes on the industry. I understand that it can be hard to see the difference between those who do games writing and those who do games journalism, but trust me when I say we actually need both. So support your favorite game news sites, publications, and people, locally and globally. We need every one of them. You can start by checking out All Things Nintendo, Brian Shea's Nintendo-themed podcast, and by continuing to support work like ours, because the only way to beat cold corporations is with a unified consumer. But hey, if you have a favorite memory of a Game Informer issue, please let me know. For Hardwired, I'm Andrew Hamilton.